Last week, we started our deep dive into the RAND Corporation's comprehensive report on early childhood programs. We talked about what constitutes such a program, how they're defined, and how they're targeted. Great, but do they work? What are the outcomes they improve? That's the topic of this week's Healthcare Triage. Hopefully you remember from last week that RAND's review covered 115 programs that met their strict criteria for inclusion and evaluation. Let's start today by setting the stage for what outcomes the programs were interested in improving. Because if you don't pick outcomes, you can't measure them. In order to classify them broadly, the researchers decided to break outcomes down into 10 categories. The first three, behavior and emotion, cognitive achievement, and child health, accounted for almost 80% of them. These were definitely the big three. Developmental delay, educational attainment, child welfare, and crime accounted together for most of the rest. A few studies focused on adult employment and earnings, family formation, and social services, or covered multiple domains. The outcomes of interest were related to the program approaches. Early childhood education focused most heavily on cognitive achievement, for instance, while also trying to improve behavior and emotion and child health. Household visits focused more on behavior and emotion and child health, as did parent education, which also focused heavily on developmental delay. Transfer programs, on the other hand, were much more focused on child health than anything else, followed by adult educational attainment. More than 2/3 of the reported outcomes come from the 1990s and 2000s, making the data more recent than might be expected from the breakdown of programs. Of course, programs that reported on outcomes in adulthood clearly had to start some time ago in order to have data for us to analyze today. Enough preparation, let's get to the results. The 3,183 outcomes, yeah, there were a lot, were favorable if they improved things to a statistically significant degree. They were unfavorable if they worsened things to a statistically significant degree. They were null if they did neither, which happened for about 70% of outcomes. Only 34 of the 3,183 outcomes were unfavorable. This is good news. It implies that early childhood intervention almost never makes anything worse. It could also be publication bias, and that programs might not publish evaluations if they had such bad results. Overall, 29% of the 3,183 outcomes had favorable results. They were spread pretty evenly over the many outcome domains. For instance, 25% of behavior and emotion outcomes were favorable, as were 34% of the cognitive achievement outcomes, and 27% of outcomes that measured child health. But what most people will care about overall is whether the programs worked. So let's take a look at this from a program perspective as well as an outcomes one. Of the 115 programs studied, only 13 improved no outcomes. That's not bad, considering that some weren't necessarily created in order to promote childhood outcomes. But how effective were they? The most common way to assess effectiveness is to calculate an effect size. It's wonky, but to do it, researchers divide the difference between the outcome and the intervention in the control group, i.e. how much of an improvement there was, by the standard deviation of the two groups combined, i.e. how much variability there was in the improvement. I know that sounds complicated, but it's a common statistic and one you will definitely hear in the future. An effect size of 0.2 is considered small, 0.5 is considered medium, and 0.8 is large. The range runs from 0 to 1, basically. Effect sizes only tell you part of the story, however. You also need to know how much you care about the outcome and how hard it is to change it. You might care more about an effect size of 0.3 on a really difficult to change critical outcome than you would an effect size of 0.7 on an easy to change, less important outcome. In order to calculate the effect sizes, the researchers conducted meta-analyses on each of the categories of outcomes by pooling the results into groups. So studies that might not have achieved statistical significance on their own have more of a chance to achieve significance due to larger sample sizes. Let's get specific. After pooling, the outcomes reporting body mass index still had huge confidence intervals, meaning that it was inconclusive as to whether these programs improved weight. But birth outcomes, like low birth weight, preterm birth, or post-birth complications, were significantly improved, with a combined effect size of 0.034. Small, but hard to change and very important. Substance use outcomes, like alcohol use, tobacco use, and the use of other drugs, were also improved significantly, with an effect size of 0.149. All three together were also significant with an effect size of 0.051. In other words, these statistics show that early childhood programs do improve child health outcomes, but they do so better for some outcomes than others. Of course, it's important to remember that some of these programs might have reported data on secondary outcomes that might not have been the primary aim of their interventions. The fact that they didn't improve those isn't necessarily their fault. Other studies have shown that the largest effect sizes are for outcomes that are aligned with the methods and intent of the programs. Next, the researchers looked at the outcomes effect sizes by the program approach. The only approach of the four that showed a statistically significant effect on overall outcomes was early childhood education. It's important to note that here we're looking at programs with their outcomes pooled together. So this is an analysis more by program than by outcome, where outcome is the, well, outcome of interest. The effect size of early childhood education was 0.12. The effect sizes of home visits, parental education, and transfers were smaller and not statistically significant. The pooled effect size of programs using a combination was essentially negative, but it was also not significant and had huge confidence intervals, meaning the programs were all over the map. They also looked at the changes in effect sizes over time. This is important because some of the stuff had become more standard of care over the years. For instance, enrollment in a Head Start program in the 1960s would have made you really different from kids that didn't have that opportunity. But today, lots more kids get early childhood education, so getting Head Start might not show as much of an effect. The results bear this out. The effect sizes for early education programs that started in the 1980s have an average effect size 0.08 smaller than those starting in the 1970s, and those starting in the 1990s are even smaller, 0.12 lower. Some studies are, of course, stronger than others, i.e. they're bigger, more rigorous, or longer, and it's possible that the weaker studies could skew results. This is a common complaint leveled against many areas of research, early childhood intervention included. People sometimes believe, and they're not always wrong, that the better studies show little difference, and that poorer studies are the ones that achieve significance. 7 of the 44 studies included in this analysis were considered to be weaker, often because they lost track of more than 1/4 of the children in the cohort over time. The results from these studies, though, weren't significantly different than the stronger studies, and when they were eliminated from the analyses, it didn't change the results. I mentioned the Community Guide Systematic Review last week. Let's use it as corroboration. They found that, overall, test scores increased by 0.29 standard deviations. They found that high school graduation increased 0.2 standard deviations. Crime decreased 0.23 standard deviations. Teen birth rates decreased 0.46 standard deviations, and self-regulation increased 0.21 standard deviations. And if you need further convincing, as I was writing this script, it seemed like every day another review was being published saying the same thing. A study out of the Harvard Graduate School of Education, for instance, ran a meta-analysis on 22 high-quality studies conducted between 1960 and 2016. They found that kids in early childhood education programs, which remember are a subset of all early childhood interventions, were less likely to be placed in special education, less likely to be held back a grade, and more likely to graduate from high school than kids who didn't attend such programs. So let's recap, because these results should be shouted from the rooftops. After nearly 50 years of evaluations, we can say a few definitive things about early childhood interventions. Most focus on improving behavior and emotion, cognitive achievement, and child health. Critics may point to the fact that so many of the findings were null, but it's important to note that 3 in 10 findings were significantly better. That's great! Moreover, 102 out of 115 programs studied had a favorable effect on at least one outcome, meaning that while you can find outcomes that didn't improve, you'd be hard-pressed to find programs that failed or produced worse outcomes. But, this is a big but, just achieving results is only one side of the story. The other side is, what did it take to achieve those results? We have to ask whether these programs are therefore worth it. How much do they cost? And what are their economic benefits? That's the topic of next week's Healthcare Triage.